Hey everyone. Big news in the NBA this offseason. Tracy McGrady officially announcing his retirement from the NBA. Officially still going to play in China, still has a big brand there. But I just want to go over the career that was T-Mac. So T-Mac being drafted by the Toronto Raptors. That's where he started his whole career up here in Canada. And eventually getting to play with his cousin Vince Carter. He was on that really good team that had him, Vince Carter, Antonio Davis, and Charles Oakley. Doing really well, but he's always going to be second fiddle to Vince Carter. And I guess he felt that being second fiddle, especially at that early point of his career, didn't make a lot of sense. A lot of people thinking that was one of the points where the Toronto Raptors really lost out, because that could have been a point where, they took the next step. They were already kind of a playoff contending team, and with T-Mac and Vince Carter growing as players and growing together, everyone makes that comparison of the small forward and shooting guard, Pippen with Jordan and all that. I don't think they would have been on that level, but they were two very, very dynamic players. If everyone remembers, Tracy McGrady, when he started his career, actually was a really good shot blocking small forward. He was really known for that, and a really good rebounder. Now, he was able to bring a lot of these skills to his other teams, but at the end he lost a little bit of that defensive prowess because he had to pick up more of a scoring slack. So the first interesting point there was there in Toronto. I think he should have stayed, but you can't fault him. I mean, a lot of players, especially early on in their careers, want to move on to teams where they are the man. So speaking of being the man, he had his opportunity next when he went to the Orlando Magic. And with the Orlando Magic, it was supposed to be this, duo of the ages. It was supposed to be him and Grant Hill. Originally, if people followed along, it was supposed to be Grant Hill and Tim Duncan, but Tim Duncan ultimately decided to stay with the San Antonio Spurs, and obviously that worked out for him. So it was supposed to be Tracy McGrady and Grant Hill, but we all remember Grant Hill's ankles turned to pixie dust, and it was basically the Tracy McGrady show for years. And we saw him win 2 NBA scoring championships, but ultimately, outside of scoring a lot of points, he didn't really accomplish much with that team. So then, as they're progressing, and they eventually in 2004 drafted Dwight Howard. And what did Tracy McGrady do after they drafted Dwight Howard? He kind of forced his way out of Orlando. And that was that trade that brought him to the Houston Rockets in exchange for Steve Francis and Cuttino Mobley in pieces. Now, this to me was his biggest mistake of his career. I mean, Tracy McGrady to me has always been this amazing talent that never had the situation that really could, fortify the situation. When you have a scoring champion in Tracy McGrady, and especially at that point of his career, he was young, going into his prime, and having a young Dwight Howard not having an offensive game really wouldn't matter, because it would just shore up that front line. And I think a lot of people, especially in Orlando, kind of have that pipe dream of what could have happened having Tracy McGrady in the backcourt and Dwight Howard in the front court. I mean, we're making all sorts of noise now about James Harden and Dwight Howard, but a young Tracy McGrady was a little bit more dynamic than James Harden. Maybe not quite the playmaker, but his overall ability, I think, was a bit superior, and obviously it was a younger Dwight Howard, not dealing with these shoulder and such injuries. So then that ends up with Tracy McGrady in Houston, where he pairs up with Yao Ming, another big man, a lot of skill, but again, injuries to both of them this time really cut short their careers. Now, Tracy McGrady after that did some stints in China. He landed on a few teams. He was on like the Atlanta Hawks, most recently San Antonio Spurs. But Tracy McGrady, I feel, will forever be that point where you have to think, if you're a young player, is it really your want to be the man, or do you want to be in a system that can allow you to win? I think too many players early on, kind of want that grandeur, because obviously they're playing for contract money, but I don't think Tracy McGrady was ever at risk of not making big dollars. So, there was the first mistake, I think, in Toronto. I think that he should have stayed. Him and Vince Carter, ultimately, do I think it's enough to win a championship? Maybe not, but they would have been a contending team for years. The Orlando mistake, I think, was the biggest. Him and Dwight Howard going forward, assuming health, of course, would have been fantastic. And I think they could have put some nice pieces around, and everyone likes to play in Orlando. It's a beautiful city. Houston, I think, wasn't really his fault. Obviously, he had some great moments there, scoring a bunch of points in, just a few seconds, and, leading his team to a 22-game winning streak. But at the end of the day, are those points that really get you into the Hall of Fame? And that's the question that everyone's asking right now. Is Tracy McGrady a Hall of Fame candidate? I mean, when you look at his career averages, outside the last few years, he's a big-time point producer, you know. And it's kind of like the same argument. Is Allen Iverson a future Hall of Famer? With Tracy McGrady, I would say on talent, yes. On production, no. And this is where the people always split their differences. Like, do you have to have playoff and championship success to be considered a Hall of Famer? Obviously, Karl Malone never winning a championship, easy first ballot Hall of Famer, but he did it for a more prolonged period of time. I mean, it's kind of a comparable argument. Do you think Grant Hill is a Hall of Famer? He had great years in Detroit, but those same injuries we were talking about there in Orlando really cut everything short. So Tracy McGrady, for me, if we were in a perfect world where you really had a strict, idea of what it counts to be a Hall of Famer, I would say no. I would say he's the perfect example of where you can choose to be picky and set an example for people. But at the end of the day, I think what we're looking at is probably going to be a Hall of Famer just because he was such a big name. I mean, we had shoes after him and everything he's doing in China. And I think the NBA is really giving a lot of credit to the international game, the spread of the sport. So I think because of that, he's going to have at least, I'll say a second ballot Hall of Famer. I mean, it's going to be tough to judge from now, but Tracy McGrady, for me, will always be that one guy who, it's the big what-if guy. He's the guy that, could have done so much if he had just stayed with the players. I mean, we saw Vince Carter when they drafted Chris Bosh there in Toronto saying, I don't want him. I want a younger guy who can, fight for me right now. And then he forced his way out there to New Jersey. But again, this was a younger, more able Vince Carter. So I think all of this really comes down to a lesson for young players going forward to really not only learn from other players' mistakes, if you want to call it a mistake, but really look for the long-term future. I mean, when you're 35, are you really going to care that you had all those scoring numbers, or are you really going to look back and say, I need those rings? And I think a lot of players realize this way too late, and I think Tracy McGrady, unfortunately, we heard one of his biggest regrets is that he couldn't bring a championship to Houston. So I think that's the thing that's really going to haunt him forever. Tracy McGrady, great player, fun player, but ultimately, he's not the guy that I think condones the idea of a Hall of Famer, but maybe I'm being too strict. So anyways, I want to know what you guys think. You can leave comments below. Always visit us at hoopslounge.com or the Hoops Lounge YouTube channel, and you can always catch me on Twitter, Sporting Phil, and my name, Phil Boileau. Anyways, we'll catch you next time, and keep in the lounge.